The closest the world ever got to a nuclear war was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Presidents including Nixon, Ford, and Carter attempted in varying degree to create an arms agreement with the Soviet Union. President Nixon and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty that froze the number of ballistic missiles the two countries held. Carter signed a second arms control agreement in 1979. However, in the 1970s, the Soviet Army entered Afghanistan, killing all chance for reconciliation. Ronald Reagan was an actor turned politician. After receiving the presidential bid, he asked voters a simple question.
Just ask yourself, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?
For a majority of Americans, the answer was no. The dignity of the president throughout the 60s and 70s had been heavily damaged in events like the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, and of course the arms race between the Americans and the Soviets. Reagan's values appealed largely to the middle-class group of voters. He also was no friend to communism. As an actor, he feared that Stalin had set out to make Hollywood an instrument of pro-communist propaganda and met secretly with the Federal Bureau of Investigations to pass along names of people in Hollywood he suspected of being a communist, and testified before the House Committee on Un-American Activities about his concerns. When he campaigned for presidency, taking a hard line against the communists was one of his many promises.
We will not surrender for it, now or ever. Our forbearance shall never be misjudged as failure of will. When action is needed to preserve our national security, we will act.
Despite his hatred of communism, however, Reagan was aware of the looming dangers that a nuclear war would face.
It's like you and me sitting in a discussion where we are each pointing a gun at each other, and if you say anything wrong or I say anything wrong, we're going to pull the trigger. And I just thought this was ridiculous mutual assured destruction. It really was a mad policy on Inauguration Day after being briefed a few days earlier on what I was to do if it ever became necessary to unleash American nuclear weapons. I'd taken over the greatest responsibility of my life. From then on, wherever I went, I carried a small plastic-covered card on which the codes I would issue to the Pentagon confirming that I was the actual President of the United States, ordering to unleash our nuclear weapons. We had many contingency plans for responding to a nuclear attack, but everything would happen so fast that I wondered how much planning or reason could be applied in such crisis. 6 minutes to decide how to respond to a blip on a radar scope and decide whether to unleash Armageddon. How could anyone apply reason at a time like that?
Despite demonstrators' attempts to freeze the arms race, Reagan believed that attempts to decrease arms had produced little results and that if America built up its arms strong enough, it would be able to force the Soviets to the negotiation table. He therefore embarked on the largest peacetime military buildup in history. The Soviets, in turn, did their best to match the U.S. pace and were forced to divert billions of dollars into their weapons program, putting even more pressure on their already falling economy. In May of 1982, Reagan claimed that he felt ready to have a personal meeting with the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, to discuss dismantling the nuclear menace.
I hope we could arrange a future meeting where positive results can be anticipated. And when we sit down, I will tell President Brezhnev that the United States is ready to build a new understanding. I will tell him that his government have nothing to fear from the United States.
Soon afterwards, Reagan announced his intention to create the Strategic Defense
To
Initiative.
have satellites orbiting space. If the Soviets attempt to shoot a missile at us, the satellite will fire a missile to deflect it.
So, you do know that this is technically possible?
It might be possible.
Might?
I mean, there's a good chance that it could be done.
But how long would it take?
I'm not sure. This technology is still untested.
I'm more concerned about how much it is going to cost.
Billions.
Billions? Really?
And furthermore, does this mean that we can strike the Soviets without responding? This could provoke World War III. If the Soviets truly believe this is a reality, they may quickly try to respond.
And furthermore, this violation.
Look, the bottom line is that I'm not sure if we can actually afford this project, even if it does work.
But we need to do something better than just sitting here fearing an attack. If it could work, finally the public would sleep more peacefully.
Well, that's a very nice fantasy, but it may not be the case. How sure are you that this is going to work?
I would be a lot more clear if I had more money for more tests.
Another fact of the matter is, once the Soviets hear about this, they're going to build so many missiles that they can overcome any defense system.
Well, that could happen, but the Soviet economy is hardly in shape to do that. It's near collapse as it is.
1983, a Korean Airlines passenger flight mistakenly veered into Soviet airspace, and the Soviets shot it down without hesitation. Reagan called that act an act of barbarism. All treaties for arms control were broken off, and it would be 2 more tense years until they returned to the negotiation table. 2 Soviet leaders, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, died in quick succession, and then came Mikhail Gorbachev. He was the youngest man to lead the Soviet Union. He cracked down on government corruption and hoped to modernize the Soviets' falling economy. However, he could not do many of those things when all of the money was being pumped into the arms race.
Our countries are different by their social systems, by all ideologies dominant in them, but we believe that that should not be a reason for animosity. Each social system has a right to life, and should prove its advantages not by force, not by military means, but on the path of peaceful competition with other systems.
Reagan's comments implied that he was ready for negotiations as well.
I believe that new opportunities are now opening up in the U.S.-Soviet relations.
Reagan and Gorbachev had their first one-on-one meeting in Geneva, Switzerland. Though their meeting was friendly on personal terms, the negotiations produced nothing more than an agreement that the 2 leaders would meet again.
We shook hands for the first time. I had to admit there was something likable about Gorbachev. There was warmth in his face and his style, not like the coldness bordering on hatred I'd seen in the most senior Soviet officials I'd met until then.
A second meeting was organized in Iceland with many of the same issues as the first. Reagan refused to back away from SDI for a Soviet promise to reduce nuclear weapons. Gorbachev believed that SDI was a military threat because although it was still far from being a reality, it could give the United States immunity from the Soviet missiles. The United States, in turn, wanted inspections to ensure compliances and Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. Later, Gorbachev met with Reagan in Washington on December 8, 1987. He was welcomed by crowds of people eager for peace. In Washington, the 2 leaders signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, eliminating a whole class of nuclear weapons made possible by Gorbachev's agreement to drop his demands that SDI should be eliminated. Despite the fact that only 4% of the country's arsenals had been eliminated, it was a historic step. But perhaps the most surpassing was that Reagan had been the one to sign the agreement, as he had promised to be tougher on the Soviets than ever before. When 8 years ago, reconciliation seemed a fantasy, Reagan set foot in the Soviet Union and in front of a bust of Lenin explained democracy to a cheering crowd.
Political leadership in a democracy requires seeing past the abstraction and embracing the vast diversity of humanity, and doing it with humility, listening as best you can, not just to those in high positions, but to cacophonous voices of ordinary people, and trusting those millions of people keeping out of their way. And the word we have for this is freedom.
2 years after Reagan's presidency, the Berlin Wall, a symbol of the growing tensions between the 2 nations, was torn down. In 1987, Reagan had given a memorable speech to bring down the wall.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I don't really know what to say here right now, but I'm just going to go ahead and just tell you about random things. So,
Michael Jackson?
Michael Jackson, I don't think he did it. I know, but,
Who?
he's gonna make a robot in, what the
So what's the homework with Mr. Ward's class?
I don't really know, I haven't really started on it, but, I think that you should start on it, because, I don't know, it's just...
But the one problem with that is that if you started it, then that wouldn't make sense. I don't really think that would make sense.
The only thing that I know is that I'm going to do really bad in the final, because it's like...
This violates the anti-ballistic missile treaty.
Are you kidding me? You should have got the dog, it's way better.
Okay, do it.
I'm allergic to that.